Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our weekly podcast, Palestine This Week, the show where we take a deep dive into the key issues from Palestine and the wider region. I am, as always, joined by my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Nasim, for having me on. It's always a pleasure to be with you,
Yeah, there's been a lot of unexpected turns over the past week.
to put it mildly.
Yeah, but we will begin as we did last week with the latest in the war between Iran and Israel. But after that, I do want to spend some time, at least half our conversation on the situation in Gaza. There's been a number of developments, as well as a EU review, European Union review of its relationship with Israel. So I wanted to take a deep dive into that. But before we do that, I just want to begin with, as I said, with the situation between Israel and Iran. Of course, Trump, I think last week when we began our show, we were anticipating that Trump would, in some shape or form, enter into the war and bomb Iran, which he did, again in a very unpredictable way. He said it'd be 2 weeks after which he'll decide, but within a few days of having said 2 weeks, he bombed the nuclear facilities. But the moment where we are now is Tuesday. There was a ceasefire. Trump announced a ceasefire last night, and this morning there's been allegations of both sides breaching the ceasefire. But before we get to that, I want to actually um, begin with actually the ceasefire itself. Um, why did Trump, or why did all the parties, Iran and Israel, what were their main motivations for why they agreed to a ceasefire requested by Trump?
Mm. Yeah, that's the key issue here, I think, and will help us determine the path moving forward. Just to remind ourselves, Nasim, when we spoke last week, we spoke extensively about the possibility of the United States getting directly engaged in offensive operations in Iranian territory, and it had an air of increasing inevitability about it. And over the weekend, the United States launched air raids into Iran that targeted three nuclear Iranian installations. And I think from the nature of these attacks, in other words, well, besides being clearly illegal and unprovoked, they were very focused on Iranian nuclear installations rather than being a broader and wider campaign, as I think the Israelis very much would have liked to see, to seek to weaken and degrade Iran's military and governmental capacity in order to set the stage for regime change. So, from those attacks, we already got an indication of the US agenda with respect to Iran and its divergence from the Israeli agenda. I think Trump had been persuaded that this war would improve and strengthen Washington's negotiating position in Iran with respect to Iran, and was informed or reached the conclusion that this one and done air raid would put an end to Iran's nuclear program and would allow Washington to dictate the terms of any subsequent agreements and eventually resumed negotiations. And I think that explains why immediately after the US bombing, Trump proclaimed the total and definitive demolition and obliteration of Iran's nuclear weapon, that they would never be able to reconstitute it, and so on. Every specialist who looked at this basically said it was a false and empty claim. But the, given that this ceasefire agreement was engineered by the United States, I think we first have to look at US motivations. And I think the US, again, having bought into the Israeli war launched against Iran on the pretext that it would improve Washington's negotiating position, had come to the conclusion that as far as degrading Iran's military and nuclear and missile capabilities, the war had run its course, and that if it continued, it would have to focus increasingly on regime change, which seems pretty clear now is no longer and perhaps never was on Trump's agenda. Secondly, there is a virtual civil war within the MAGA cult in Washington, within the Republican Party, between those who want nothing to do with another war in the Middle East, and certainly not one that the United States would fight on Israel's behalf, and those who would like to see Washington take the lead and go all the way and basically reinstall the monarchy in Tehran by July 4th. And given these divisions, Trump, who I think is not committed to either faction because the only faction he really cares about is himself and his family and his businesses, decided that the United States had to make a quick and clear decision, either to go all in or to extract itself from what was inexorably heading towards deeper United States involvement and the possibility of a regional war. And my own view is that Trump may have also finally realized that he had been quite cleverly snookered by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In other words, that Netanyahu, that Israel and its loyalists and allies and other hawks in Washington sold Trump a war on the pretext that it was a negotiating tactic, and Trump finally came to the realization that this had nothing to do with negotiations, that this was about eliminating the prospect of negotiations, and that the real purpose was to overthrow the government in Tehran. And I think it was on this basis that the United States began pushing for a ceasefire. Now, if you want to end the war that Israel started, the only way to do that is to get on the phone, call the Israeli prime minister, remind him who's boss, and tell him what to do. And this appears to be exactly what Trump did. There is, of course, one additional factor, which is that Iran yesterday, Sunday, launched its retaliation against the US bombing. And this was in the form of a
You mean Monday?
telegraph.
Yesterday was Monday. Sorry, we're recording
I'm
Tuesday, so
sorry,
Monday.
yesterday,
Yeah.
Monday. Thanks for the
Mm.
correction. Um, uh, and Iran launched its retaliation in the form of a telegraphed missile attack on the key US Air Force base, Al Udeid in Qatar, which caused no casualties and was largely performative and may have caused damage, but nothing else. And so given that the US had advance warning of this attack, that it had evacuated the space even before it received a warning about this attack. Trump, despite his blood-curdling threats about what the United States would do to Iran if it sought in any way to retaliate against the US bombing, was basically able to dismiss the Iranian attack as harmless firecrackers, which, for all intents and purposes, they were. That I think explains the motivation and context for the key player, the United States. The second one is Iran. Iran, of course, never wanted this war. It viewed this war, which it was, as an Israeli war, unprovoked, illegal Israeli war of aggression against Iran, and has said from the very beginning that if and when Israel stops attacking Iran, Iran will stop retaliating against Israel. And although Iran's missile capabilities were proving increasingly effective, despite the very widespread and intense Israeli attacks on those capabilities, and although it was hard hit in the US attacks and other Israeli attacks on its nuclear facilities, its nuclear program was not destroyed. Its ballistic missile program was relatively intact. It managed to absorb an extremely powerful Israeli opening salvo of widespread assassinations of senior military commanders and so on, and remained standing, remained coherent. and therefore could afford to go into the ceasefire. Now, had it not done so, we would have looked at a prolonged war of attrition between Israel and Iran. And I think, well, you can make the argument that Iran is better prepared for such a scenario and is better able to absorb the blows of a war of attrition than is Israel, or for that matter, the United States. Such a war posed very significant risks to Iran. It would mean increasing and increasingly intense Israeli attacks on Iran. It would increase the likelihood of greater US and potentially European involvement in offensive operations against Iran. And Iran's trump card, shutting down the Straits of Hormuz and rattling global energy markets or expanding the war regionally, would mean basically burning the bridges that the Iranians had carefully cultivated with Gulf states over the past few years, and not being able to export any of its own oil to China. So if you do a cost benefit analysis from the Iranian perspective, there may have been some advantages to prolonging this war as a war of attrition, which I think would have been placed Israel at a clear disadvantage. But the cost that Iran would have had to pay for continuing along this path of a war that it didn't want to begin with, and that it has said since the beginning that it was not interested in, and would end. The cost of that for Iran would have been, I believe, prohibitively expensive. And at the end of the day, it was offered a ceasefire with no political conditions. It wasn't required to capitulate or unconditional surrender or any of that gibberish. And it had demonstrated its deterrent capability to hit back at every Israeli attack on Iranian soil. So the question mark is over Israel. Israel had demonstrated its deep penetration of the Iranian state and society and military establishment through these assassinations and so on. It had caused significant and, in some respects, severe damage to Iran, but it had not achieved a single one of its military objectives. And just to recall what these were, the destruction of Iran's nuclear program, the destruction of Iran's nuclear ballistic missile capabilities, compelling Iran to sever its relationships with its coalition partners throughout the region in what is known as the axis of resistance. And of course, last but most importantly, effectuating regime change in Iran. None of those were met. Israel was sustaining unprecedented damage to its home front as a result of these Iranian ballistic missile attacks. And just as importantly, Israel's anti missile defenses were increasingly ineffective. Its defenses were not only getting degraded, but also depleted. But nevertheless, the tenor among Israeli leaders was very much one of continuing until they had assassinated Iran's supreme leader Khamenei, and until they had fomented a mass popular uprising against the Islamic Republic in Iran, basically until they had achieved the removal of the Iranian regime. And it was in this context, the proverbial phone call from Washington to the Israeli leader saying basically, you're going to stop. You're not going to achieve your objectives if you continue. And not only that, we're not going to let you continue to try to reach your unattainable objectives because we have more important fish to fry. And I think it's in that context that the Qataris were able to mediate with the Iranians and the Israelis, and the Americans were able to get the Israelis to accept the proposal for a ceasefire. Now, if I could just make one more point, the Iranians did not formally accept a ceasefire agreement with Israel. And I think this is because they reject entering into any agreement, any formal agreement with Israel. Rather, the Iranians indicated that if Israel ceases military attacks against Iran, then Iran will reciprocate by no longer firing at Israeli territory. Now, this may sound like an agreement to you and me, but formally, they have not accepted any agreement to which both Israel and Iran are a party.
Before I ask you about who won this round, it seems to be, well, from what you're saying, that Iran has won this round because Israel has not met its key objectives. So we can get to that. But I wanted to ask you about something you said in your response, which is that the US was snookered, or Trump was snookered, in a sense, which forced his hand and forced him to bomb the Iranian nuclear facilities. So are you of the opinion that Trump was actually negotiating in good faith with the Iranians? In the 60-day negotiation that took place. But then something happened which persuaded, or Netanyahu persuaded or forced Trump's hand by, without informing Trump, bombing Iran. And then again, in this case, Netanyahu persuaded Trump to, I guess Trump requested 2 weeks, didn't he? And even after declaring that he will take 2 weeks to make an announcement, something happened behind the scene and he was persuaded to strike Iranian nuclear facilities. Seems that behind the scene, Trump was not really willing, but something was happening which applied pressure on him and persuade him to always go along with the Israeli line. And bear in mind also that the American position has always been that Iran cannot use nuclear material for weaponization, but they can enrich uranium up to 3%. The American line is at 3%, no weaponization, but the Israeli line is at no uranium whatsoever. So again, Trump went with the Israeli line, and I think if you've been led by the Israelis in the way Trump has been, and then Trump issues a ceasefire declaration, and Israel breaks that ceasefire declaration. I think, do you think that this explains why he is as angry as he is visibly, as we saw all day today? He came out, he blamed the Israelis in a way which we've never seen any American do. He said both sides, none of these guys understand anything. He used the F word. So do you think that rage is really because he now has recognized or come to realize that he's been conceding on Israeli narratives all the way for him to be now betrayed? Do you think that kind of explains why he is as angry as he is now?
Yes, I mean, to answer the first part of your question, Trump and good faith are contradictions in terms. I mean, Trump has never done anything in good faith, and certainly not the negotiations with Iran. What I think happened when I say that Trump was snookered is that he was persuaded that by putting forward this, sorry, just to back up a second, I don't think Trump was negotiating in good faith because he's never done anything in good faith. The question, rather, is whether at the outset Trump was negotiating seriously in the sense that his objective in negotiating with Iran was to conclude an agreement, or whether Trump never intended to reach an agreement and conducted these negotiations solely to lull the Iranians into a false sense of security so that Israel and the United States could attack them more effectively than would be otherwise the case. My view is that Washington was serious about pursuing a diplomatic resolution with Iran, at least at the outset. But what happened is that a coalition consisting of Israel, its loyalists in the Trump administration and elsewhere in Washington, and the war hawks and the anti-Iran war hawks, managed to persuade Trump, who initially put his red line in the negotiations as Iran can never possess a nuclear weapon, and the United States must acquire watertight guarantees that that can never happen. He then his negotiator and effective Secretary of State, Steve Witkoff, then shifted the goalposts and said that actually the United States will not accept any agreement that allows Iran to continue enriching uranium, even at very low levels for exclusively civilian purposes, on its own territory. Now, why did this cause a crisis in the negotiations? Well, Iran, under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it has signed, but Israel has not, has a right to enrich uranium under clear constraints on its own territory. And the United States was basically demanding that Iran renounce its internationally recognized rights for the sake of Israel, which of course has absolutely no inspections and hasn't ratified the NPT and all the rest of it. And my belief is that this Israeli American anti Iran coalition initially persuaded Trump and Witkoff, who we have to remember, are not the brightest people. Trump is not exactly a stable genius, and they don't really understand the Middle East, and they certainly don't understand Iran. I think they were persuaded that this was a realistic objective and that the Iranians could be bullied into accepting it. When, as anyone could have told you, the Iranians rejected that demand out of hand, then it was step two. And Trump was persuaded that if he would endorse an Israeli attack on Iran, that this would leave Iran with no choice but to capitulate, not only on the nuclear issue, but also on its ballistic missile program, its regional posture, and so on. And it was at that point that I think negotiations were no longer serious, and the United States pretended to be still conducting the negotiations as an act of subterfuge to lull the Iranians into a false sense of security and allow Israel to attack more effectively. And subsequently, um, uh, Trump was persuaded that it would only take the single massive air raid, American air raid, on Iran's nuclear facilities to either end Iran's nuclear program or force Iran to surrender. And when that failed as well, I think, then a faint light bulb began to light up between Trump's ears and under his orange hair that, well, maybe I'm being led down the garden path by the Israelis, and maybe I'm being snookered into a very different agenda, which is one of overthrowing the Iranian regime, and I'm not doing these things in order to strengthen my negotiating position, as I've been repeatedly told. So I think that explains the genesis of the ceasefire agreement. Of course, we won't know the confirmed details for another 20 or 30 years until all the relevant documentation is released. If it's not destroyed, well, actually, we might find out much sooner if another signal chat is leaked. But I think that explains the ceasefire. Now, your question about why Trump erupted in anger at Israel Tuesday morning, I think that's a slightly different issue. So Trump put forward a ceasefire proposal. It called for um, uh, Iran to cease fire at a certain point and the Israelis to do so 12 hours later. And it was a little unclear, but clearly the intention was not that the Iranians would stand down, sit back, and allow the Israelis to continue bombing the hell out of Iran for another 12 hours before the Israelis stood down. And as Trump put it, the minute the Iranians stopped firing, Israel basically sent its entire air force towards Iran to conduct very heavy bombing raids, and Trump recognized that this would destroy the ceasefire. And it was in that context, I think, that he erupted in anger. There is, of course, also the issue that Iran, either in a deliberate effort to get the last word in, or perhaps because of a communications breakdown, fired several missiles that clearly violated the ceasefire were fired after it went into force. But they were apparently successfully intercepted or landed in an open area or whatever. And when the Israelis basically responded by saying we're now going to raise the center of Tehran to the ground, that's when Trump stepped in and told Netanyahu, "I'm not going to allow you to ruin my ceasefire." And Netanyahu claimed he couldn't recall the planes, but instead of dropping their cargo, if you will, over central Tehran, they attacked a radar station in northern Iran instead. So quite clearly, the Israelis um, felt they were forced into a ceasefire before they achieved their war objective. You just look at the meltdown that its apologists are having about this. And once
Before
they
we
were
get to that
forced
point,
into
so
that,
before we get to that point, I just think just focus on Trump's statement itself declaring a
yes,
ceasefire. It seemed quite confusing, though. I mean, it seemed like he gave the Israelis 6 additional hours after the Iranians
12, in
stopped
fact. Yeah.
12 hours. So um, Trump is guilty of miscommunication and giving mixed
Yeah.
messages, as he has always been. And in this case, he seemed to give the Israelis 12 additional hours. And I get the sense that, there is a scenario where he was actually played by the Israelis. And I think there's a slow realization that, I've been, as you said, led down this merry path, and then I issue a declaration or call for a ceasefire. You're the U.S. president, the most powerful person in the world, and then Israelis go on a bombing raid, and that I would assume would humiliate someone like Trump. And if anything, Trump will respond to humiliation in a way which I think most other US presidents could probably brush aside. But I think Trump is like that. So he's guilty of that miscommunication, and
Yeah,
then I think,
certainly. Yeah.
and his I think his reaction, the anger, is probably a realization of that. Yeah. So over to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the tweet or whatever posts on Truth Social are called announcing the ceasefire, you're entirely correct. I mean, it's as clear as pea soup. What exactly it meant or was supposed to mean, no one can tell you. I doubt even Trump can tell you. My suspicion is that it was an attempt to save face for Israel by basically saying that Iran would have to desist from any hostile action for a full 12 hours before Israel would commit to the ceasefire. But that's purely speculation on my part. What I think we can categorically exclude is that Trump meant and Israel interpreted Trump to say that there would be a 12-hour window in which Israel would remain free to attack Iran at will, and Iran had committed not to respond to any such attacks. That was never going to happen. And anyone who believed that this would be a serious approach quite clearly doesn't understand Iran, doesn't understand what a ceasefire is, and doesn't want a ceasefire, but is simply looking for a pretext to prolong the war. But first of all, you had these absolutely massive Israeli air raids, the most intense ones yet on Tehran before the ceasefire went into effect. And then you had the Iranian violations of the ceasefire, where they fired, I think, two or three ballistic missiles towards Israel after the ceasefire went into effect, and these were intercepted and didn't really cause any damage. And Trump even went so far as to say, I don't even know if they were fired deliberately. And Israel seemed to seize on that Iranian violation um, uh, by preparing to launch an even larger bombing raid on central Tehran that would have destroyed the ceasefire. And it was at that point that Trump saw his work going up in smoke, potentially, and made this unprecedented statement in which, perhaps for the first time in recent American history, a US president publicly identified Israel rather than its adversary as the main culprit. You'll remember in the Biden years, Biden would put forward a proposal through his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Hamas would accept it, Israel would reject it, and then Biden and Blinken would get up in public and say Israel has accepted it, but Hamas has rejected it. So, this is a very refreshing turn of events, and you look at the Israel flunkies and Israel apologists, they're just beside themselves with anger and rage of how dare the US president actually call a spade a spade. It's his absolute moral and political responsibility to always put the blame on our enemies, even when this has absolutely no connection to reality. But yes, it is unprecedented. And the key question now is, because Trump is such a impulsive and unpredictable narcissist, could this have any repercussions on Washington's continued indulgence of Israel's genocide in the Gaza Strip? I think we'd be getting way ahead of ourselves to say that that is now going to happen.
Before we
Um,
get to that point,
yeah,
I was going to ask you a question about that later on. But before we do that, I
sure.
just want to finish the segment of
Yeah,
on Iran and Israel.
sure.
And you mentioned Israeli flunkies, and I have a question about that specifically because here again we had America firsters, head to head with Israeli firsters, and this time once again Israeli firsters won in the sense that they managed to pull an American president into joining a war with Israel. So, I mean, how damaging is that to the American psyche, the American public, given that it convinces the Americans that Israel has sway over the US in a way no other country does, and I would say, many of the, it's not conspiracy, many of the assumptions have been proven now to be true. So what does that do for the Israeli firsters? Because here again, as I said, there was a head-to-head battle
Mhm.
between the two, and the American firsters appear to have lost, and the Israeli firsters won.
Well, it's a very good question, and I would answer that in two parts. The first part, to point out that Trump has transformed the Republican Party into a personality cult. And so, regardless of what people may think about any of Trump's policies, given that he's also an exceptionally accomplished demagogue, I don't think anyone at the end of the day can challenge him. And we saw that, in the run-up to the U.S. Bombing of Iran, where you had many on the right, certainly more actively than among the Democratic Party leadership, where Schumer's main contribution was to denounce Trump as a chicken for not bombing Iran. But all these voices of dissent within the American right, like Tucker Carlson and others, were basically dismissed out of hand. And then Trump made an object lesson out of his director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who had been an outspoken opponent of this war and U.S. participation in it. But once she was warned, within 17 minutes, came out with a statement that Iran was going to possess a nuclear arsenal by the time she left the podium. And so that, when you're dealing with a personality cult, particularly one led by an effective demagogue, the house always wins, so to speak. But having said that, Americans, and particularly those in the MAGA cult, have now had an object lesson in learning how Israel managed to successfully drag the United States into a war of Israel rather than Washington's choosing. And just as importantly, particularly because many of them genuinely believe or subscribe to all these conspiracy theories, that Washington is run by AIPAC and the Israel lobby and so on, they have now also been given an object lesson that Israel is not this omnipotent, omniscient entity that can never be successfully challenged, but that they now have a very clear demonstration that all it takes is a phone call from the US president to the Israeli prime minister, and Israel will do exactly as it's told. So that I think is very valuable moving forward as well.
And we will move forward in us discussing what that means for Gaza. But before I do that, I want to go back to one of the questions I wanted to ask earlier, which is who won this round? I guess, given what you've said, Israel has lost this round because its stated aim was regime change. It didn't manage to do that. Then I guess the question is, what would a loss mean for the Israelis? I think it's a really important question here. If Israel is seen to have lost this round against the Iranians, given its stated aim, I think just as America has now opened its eyes to see the amount of sway Israel has over US presidents, I think a narrative of defeat for Israel, given how optimistic it was about regime change and destroying Iran. Iran is just a paper tiger. What does that do for the American psyche and also the Israeli psyche?
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say that any party has emerged strengthened from this 2 week war. The Iranians have been very severely hit. They were unable to, for example, get the Russians or the Chinese to replenish their air defenses during the war and so on. But having said that, they remained standing. They repeatedly demonstrated that they would neither capitulate nor be deterred. And against that, Israel, which is the party that possesses overwhelming force in this relationship, was unable to deal the decisive blow that was the whole point of the war that it launched. So while I don't think this is a situation in which you can clearly assign any party as victor or vanquished, I would argue that Israel did not emerge strengthened, and when it is a particular party that initiates a war for specific objectives and it fails to achieve those objectives, I think it's fair to say that its position certainly has not improved and arguably may be somewhat weakened, particularly when you consider that Israel has been trumpeting its destruction of Iran's ballistic missile capabilities. And every time Netanyahu opened his mouth to make this point, a few more ballistic missiles would come flying into Israeli territory and evade the densest anti missile defenses on the planet. Moving forward now, the key issue is the politics. Um, it's quite clear that Iran is not going to return to the negotiating table absent a U.S. guarantee that it recognizes Iran's rights to enrich uranium for civilian purposes on Iranian territory pursuant to the relevant framework established by the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. It's also clear as daylight that Iran will categorically refuse to discuss its ballistic missile program or its regional relationships in any negotiations with the United States. It will simply say, this is none of your business. Go talk to someone else about something else. Um, at the same time, Iran has some crucial decisions to make. I suspect that the Iranian leadership is now under sustained pressure, not only from within its own ranks, but also from broader Iranian society, to renounce the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, to expel the inspectors of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and to either leave it at that or to actually cross the nuclear Rubicon and develop or acquire a nuclear bomb covertly. In other words, Iran, which acquired the status of a nuclear threshold state, um, essentially as a bargaining tactic in order to have leverage of its own in its negotiations with the West, may now view that status not as a negotiating tactic, but as a pathway to enable the acquisition of the ultimate deterrent. We don't know how this will play out, but if Iran does proceed in that direction, it could create very serious and new complications in which I don't think Israel, and arguably not the United States either, are going to stand idly by.
If Iran is to dig its heels in, and do you think any negotiation between the Americans and the Iranians um, would mean that Iran would be in a better position to seek an end to the genocide in Gaza? Do you think they would put that as a proposal? Because all this began with the genocide in Gaza. Iran has been calling for the end to the genocide in Gaza and has been supporting Hamas as well. So, do you think that would be a condition? And also, I mean, going back to what we were speaking earlier, and what are the lessons from the past 2 weeks for the Americans going forward in negotiations over Gaza and the genocide in Gaza? What do you think they would have learned, and what lessons do you think they would have drawn in how they deal with the Israelis in continuing American support for the genocide?
Unfortunately, I don't see the Iranians putting this forward as a condition for any agreement. And even if they did, I think we're quite a long way off from reaching any agreement. And secondly, neither the United States nor its European allies, nor Israel would ever accept a condition um, uh, proposed by Iran or anyone else unless it's under compelling force. Um, the problem is twofold in response to your question. Will this, um, I don't want to call it a rupture, call it whatever you will, between Trump and Netanyahu. And bear in mind, we're dealing here with a narcissist demagogue who takes things very personally and who appears to now have come to the realization that he was being dragged into a prolonged war, exactly the type of war he spent the past decade denouncing, that he was being dragged into one by Israel. Will this have the effect of him now also making a second phone call and calling time on Israel's genocide in the Gaza Strip? Or, as we've seen previously, will Israel be gifted a continuation and intensification of the Gaza genocide as compensation for having been told to stop its war with Iran? I think that's an unanswered question, but certainly, when you're dealing with a personality cult and the leader of the cult begins attacking a foreign ally and its head of state in the unprecedented terms that we've seen Trump do, this basically sends a signal to the membership of the cult that it's open season on that foreign state and its leader. And this could lead to a situation in which we will see a cascade of consequences. But I certainly would not go so far as to say we've now turned a corner either in the U.S.-Israeli relationship or in U.S. indulgence for the Gaza genocide.
Well, just take a step back for a minute. I mean, of course, the world's attention has been focused on Iran and Israel. But while that's been going on, there's been an extermination campaign in Gaza. There's the last statistics I read was that 2 million Palestinians are now living in 18% of Gazan territory. And last week there was another mass casualty event. Israel started shooting at Palestinians seeking aid in the Gaza Aid Distribution Center. So while all this is going on, do you think there's a relationship between that and the war Israel launched against Iran? Because if you look back in history, wars have always been used by the Israelis as a camouflage to carry out ethnic cleansing. We saw that in 1948, we saw that in 1967. And I suspect maybe this was also a scenario in the minds of Israelis that, if we can initiate some kind of a regional war, that war could be used to push the Palestinians out from the Gaza Strip, because all the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are more or less, caged into a small territory. and a war would be the perfect cover, as it was in 1948, as it was in 1967. Do you think that is a so? Do you think that link exists in the minds of the
I,
Israelis?
yes, I think that link exists, and I have been warning for several weeks that if this conflict turns into a regional conflict with global consequences, and the U.S. Becomes intensively involved in it, then you have a situation where Israel could feel empowered, enabled, capable of mass expulsions of Palestinians, not only from the Gaza Strip but also from the West Bank, and potentially including Palestinian citizens of Israel as well. I suspect that scenario has now been avoided, but I don't think that Gaza was the motivation for Israel to launch its war on Iran. I think Israel's primary motivation was an effort to perpetuate its monopoly on the possession of nuclear weapons in the Middle East, and secondarily, to go after what it views as the head of the snake, Tehran, the head of the octopus, as the Israelis put it, in order to fundamentally reconfigure the strategic equation in the Middle East. The reason I don't think Gaza was a primary motivation is because there was nothing to divert from. And we'll talk about this in a moment, but where was the significant international pressure and significant policy change from Israel's sponsors and allies that would have required Israel to launch a war to divert attention? It simply wasn't there.
Mm. And talking about Israel's sponsors and allies, the European Union has conducted review of its association, this economic agreement with the Israelis, and it found that there are more than 30 violations that Israel is guilty of in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. I guess you can provide us some details of that, but more importantly, I think given that they've all admitted and or recognized that there are 30 plus violations in their own agreement, do you think the EU will change its tact, its position on Israel?
No.
At the moment, it doesn't seem like that will be the
No,
case.
never, never, never. The European Union will declare war on itself. It will invade Germany before it takes any significant policy measures against Israel. Absolutely out of the question. Don't even consider it. Look, this review deals with assessing whether or not Israel is violating its fundamental human rights obligation pursuant to its association agreement um, uh, with uh, with the European Union. In other words, over the past 25 years of apartheid, over the past 25 years of killing children with increasing frequency in the occupied territories, over the past 25 years of consistent and accelerated settlement expansion, over the past 25 years of systematic torture of Palestinians in Israeli prisons, over the past 25 years of an Israeli judiciary that is completely stacked against the Palestinians. During those past 25 years, the European Union has still not been able to determine whether or not Israel is violating its human rights obligations pursuant to this association agreement. In other words, the European Union will never reach such a determination. And I should have added, and during the past 2 years of live stream genocide, Brussels haven't been able to figure out, is this something we should be concerned about or is it not? Now, under pressure from European public opinion and several EU member governments, the EU has not taken any measures against Israel, but rather has launched a review because Brussels still doesn't know whether genocide is a good or maybe not good thing. It might not be good, but it probably is. On that basis, Brussels has decided what is really needed is a review so that the European Union can can have a basis on which to assess whether apartheid is good or bad, whether genocide is good or bad, whether raping prisoners to death in the Israeli gulag is good or bad. And the people who were tasked with conducting this review um, produced their document in which they identified, I believe, 38 specific fields in which Israel was an indisputable violation of human rights. But this document did not, as far as I understand, did not make policy recommendations. Um, and it basically just provided a laundry list of all of Israel's violations. And the conclusion, as we've heard from probably the most spineless diplomat of the past 2,000 years, the EU foreign policy chief, Kaya Kallas, was that there are indications that Israel may be in violation of its human rights obligations. In other words, in the vacuum between her ears, there is still no indication whether genocide is wonderful or is perhaps not as fantastic as Israel claims. You know, should apartheid go on for another 100 years or maybe just 50? Sorry, I'm being
Yeah, I
cynical.
mean, some of the violations are violations of the prohibitions against apartheid, violations of the prohibitions
Mm,
against
mm.
torture and other
Yeah,
cruel,
yeah,
inhumane treatment. So
yeah.
they're not, they're not minor violations. These are big
No,
violations,
no.
major
And
violations.
the question for the Europeans is, do we really want to continue with the destruction of international law, of what they call the rules-based international order, of incinerating the norms and values on which the European Union claims to be founded and seeks to promote worldwide for the sake of Israeli impunity? Do we really want to do this? And it appears to be Brussels' considered opinion that yes, given a choice between reigning in Israeli impunity or setting fire to the international order and international law and international legal institutions and so on, they've made a clear choice. Israeli impunity comes first. And Kallas, of course, said that faced with this review, we're going to take the absolutely unprecedented, drastic step of entering into discussion with the Israelis.
Yeah, that's the last I read about that. Another interesting story. I mean, it's quite funny how this story hasn't gained more traction, given how much the Americans have been politicized US aid. US aid, as you know, what's his name? Musk came in and he set up this department of efficiency and targeted US aid and the amount of funding that Americans were giving to charities all over the world. Now it turns out the US aid is being used or diverted into funding the disastrous Gaza humanitarian foundation run by a bunch of mercenaries and Israelis. And I wonder what the MAGA crowd would make of such a revelation. I mean, this is not money going to the UN or any recognized charity. This is money going to an entity that's
Mm, mm,
basically playing a major role in the genocide and ethnic
mm.
cleansing of
Yeah.
Palestinians.
Yeah, well, I find it entirely appropriate, or not appropriate, but it's entirely unsurprising that the US would repurpose um, development funds to promote genocide. I mean, you know, how can we be surprised by that? And I suspect that there are many in the MAGA cult who will not take a liking to this, if only because they don't feel any U.S. taxpayers' funds should be spent outside the borders of the United States. And while this is a significant issue, I haven't seen it gain any traction in the U.S. for the simple reason that it hasn't really received widespread publicity. And I suspect the vast majority of people are not even aware of this. And as far as they are concerned, the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, was destroyed by Musk on Trump's behalf and no longer exists, and that's really all they know.
Let's on this. I mean, talk about premature. Times of Israel ran a story today saying that Netanyahu is weighing up a snap election because he feels that, in light of success in Iran, his popularity has gone up. So talk about living in a bubble. So, I mean, it sounds extraordinary. I mean, Netanyahu's popularity gone up, and the idea of a snap election, that is really premature. I mean, what's your thoughts on that? Do you think that could happen?
Well, as we've discussed previously, there were growing divisions within Israel about the wisdom of continuing the Gaza war if genocide came at the expense of an agreement through which Israel could retrieve its remaining captives from the Gaza Strip. Um, I think the fissures were growing. I don't think they had yet become, let's say, particularly significant. But then you had the war in Iran, and in contrast, there was a solid cross-party consensus throughout Israel about the war against Iran. There was very little dissent from that. Now, Trump brought that to an end. Netanyahu, who's also an accomplished demagogue, by the way, came out and basically said, Israel exceeded its expectations, um, achieved every single one of its war objectives, and then some. And I don't think that's the primary reason he would call a snap election, because I think by the time people go to the voting booth, it will become clear that Netanyahu is telling a rather tall tale. Rather, I think this should be seen against the background of a crisis that existed within his coalition on the eve of the war against Iran regarding the conscription, or rather exemptions, given to ultra Orthodox Jews in terms of not performing military service. And this is an issue of growing divisions within not only Israeli society, but also within Netanyahu's governing coalition. And it could be an attempt to, let's say, reconfigure the makeup of the coalition, that Netanyahu will go to the polls in the hope that a new election will, on the one hand, strengthen or at least not weaken him, because he is, after all, being given credit by many Israelis for launching this war, at least for now. But at the same time, he may also be hoping that it would weaken these ultra-Orthodox political parties, which have been so crucial to his governing coalition.
We must end it there, Moin. Moin, it's been a pleasure talking to you as always. Thank you for
Thank you.
tuning in and listening to our weekly review show, Palestine This Week, with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Hope to see you again next week. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.